Clear to play.
Matthew here from MiniWargaming.com, and this is another video in the series of how to play Warhammer 40k 6th edition. Today we are going to talk about transports. Now, as you can see in front of you, transports come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. I've got 3 here as an example of what you can come across, but you're going to come across all sorts of transport vehicles. Transports are used just for that, for transporting troops across the battlefield. You either use them to be a little quicker, maybe they're faster than the troops, or just to provide some extra protection. So starting on the left, we have a Space Marine Land Raider. Land Raiders are probably the biggest, beefiest transports out there with a very high armor value all around. And they just usually transport in Terminators or a large group of Tactical Marines. In the center, we have a drop pod. This one follows special rules where it actually comes in from the sky, doing something we call deep striking, which means it can come on any point of the table, and then unloads the units from inside. On the right, we have a Necron Ghost Ark. And these ones obviously are for Necrons, not Space Marines. And you can see the Necrons inside. This one has all sorts of special rules, one being that it's open-topped, which means, well, we'll talk about that in just a second. But it also has special rules like repairing nearby Necrons and, well, all sorts of other things that we're not going to get into this video. Just want to show you some of the different options that you do have. Every transport has a few stats besides the regular vehicle stats. First off, it has a transport capacity. If we look at this very basic Space Marine Rhino, it has a transport capacity of 10, which means it can carry up to 10 normal infantry-sized models. Now, if an independent character like this Space Marine Commander decides to join a squad, he can actually go in the vehicle with them, even though he's not originally part of that squad, as long as he doesn't bring it over that 10-man limit. In this case, we have 9 Space Marines in the 1 tactical squad, so he can join them and go on that vehicle just fine. Every transport also has a certain number of fire points and a certain number of access points. A fire point determines if the people that they're transporting can fire out of the vehicle while they're inside of it. So the number of fire points is how many models are allowed to shoot. Space Marine Rhino only has 1. An open-top vehicle has an infinite number of fire points. Basically, it means that everybody inside is allowed to fire. So they're really nice, although they have their own disadvantages as well. A transport also has a certain number of access points. And this is where the men can go inside or can disembark from the vehicle. So embarking and disembarking in the vehicle are in the access points. And we'll cover how to do both embarking and disembarking. In the case of this Rhino, he has 3 access points. He has one on the side, on the other side, and also one on the rear. The Land Raider that you saw earlier only has 1 out the front. And open-top vehicles, once again, they don't have any number of access points. You can basically access them from anywhere on the vehicle. When a unit is inside of a vehicle, they count as being fearless. We talked about that in the morale video. Basically, fearless means that they'll never have to make a morale check. So if somehow they had casualties while inside the vehicle, they wouldn't have to make a morale check. Now let's talk about how to embark or go inside of a transport. If the transport is what's called a dedicated transport, in other words, when you're picking your units, when you're building your army, some of the units can bring a dedicated transport. If they bring a dedicated transport, then they can start inside of that vehicle when the game starts. Otherwise, you have to embark on it during the game itself. The way that you embark is simply to move every model to within 2 inches of an access point. If not every model can get to within 2 inches, then the entire unit has to stay outside. So it's all or nothing. Everybody gets in or nobody. So here we can move, and remember that this one has access points on the side and on the back. So there's lots of options for them to get inside of it. So we'll just move here. Typically you just measure from the back, and if they're all within 6 inches, you would just remove them from the board. So since these are within 2 inches of an access point, we could simply remove them and put them aside. And then usually people will mark what is inside of a vehicle by putting the main character or something that represents who is going to be inside the vehicle on top. But that's just more a preference. If a unit embarks on a transport before the transport moves, the transport can then move as normal, including pivoting on the spot, moving its normal combat or cruising speed, and even moving flat out. If the vehicle already moved before the passengers got on board, then it cannot move any further. To disembark a squad from a vehicle, it's a little bit different, but not too complicated. Essentially, the vehicle can't move more than 6 inches. Also, it cannot move any further once they disembark. So for example, you couldn't move the Rhino up like this, disembark the passengers, and then pivot it so that it's facing a better direction. You're not allowed to do that. Basically, once it's done moving and once the unit disembarks, it cannot go any further that turn. And you cannot tank shock or ram if you've been embarking or disembarking. We're not going to talk about tank shocks or ramming in this video because that just doesn't have to really do with transports. In order to disembark a unit, we bring them back onto the table, except that we got to have them come out of the access point. Essentially, you do it like this. You take a model, you put it right at the access point, and then it can move as normal. So that would normally be up to 6 inches. And then you take the next one and put it next to the access point. Now you're supposed to put it within 1 inch of the access point. So you could technically start it a little further just to gain a little bit extra movement. And you just keep doing that for each model. Now once you've got a few out there, obviously you know that anything behind them is less than 6 inches. And so you just kind of move them out how you like. Now it's important to note that when you're coming out of a vehicle, you're not allowed to assault that same turn unless the vehicle is an assault vehicle or is an open top vehicle. One special thing to note is an independent character can choose to disembark by himself, or if the unit is already inside the transport and there's room for him, he could choose to embark onto the vehicle and join that unit. Sometimes a unit inside a transport will find themselves in the unfortunate event of being surrounded. In this case, there's no way to place a model within 1 inch of an access point. If that happens, you are allowed to perform what's called an emergency disembarkation. And that is, you can actually have the Space Marines or the guys inside the transport anywhere within 1 inch of the hull, and then they can perform their movement. Now there's a big disadvantage to doing this, and that is if your squad leaves by any other method than the access points, once they've made their movement, they cannot do any other voluntary actions for the rest of the turn. That means they can't shoot, that means they can't assault, that means they can't use any special powers or anything else. If the vehicle is totally surrounded by impassable terrain or by other models, then you simply cannot disembark. If a transport is assaulted, then the embarked unit can actually choose to do Overwatch if they so desire, which usually you'll want to. Now this is just like in a regular shooting phase, except that you're limited by the number of fire points on the transport. In the case of the Space Marine Rhino, it only has 1 fire point, which means only 1 model will be able to Overwatch. And obviously in this case, we would want to choose the guy with a flamer, because he gets D3 automatic hits with his flamer rule, rather than having to roll on a 6 to hit. So it works, other than that, it works just like Overwatch. You can't use your blast weapons because it's a snapshot, and you have to hit on 6s, your ballistic skill is reduced to a 1, and flamers get D3 attacks. Doesn't really matter. You also only get to Overwatch once. Something to note though is if a transport is wrecked or explodes from the close combat, any wounds that it causes to passengers don't really count towards that combat. So it's not towards combat resolution, you're not locked in combat or anything else like that. However, if a unit is inside a transport when the transport takes damage, and this could be in the shooting phase, movement phase, or even in the assault phase, they might be affected. Now there's a few different ways that a vehicle can get damaged, and we'll probably cover this in another video. But if there is a crew shaken result, then the passengers can only fire snapshots in their next shooting phase. And that includes if they disembark. If it's a crew stunned result, the passengers cannot shoot in their next shooting phase, but otherwise are unaffected. And that includes also if they disembark. If there's a weapon destroyed or the vehicle is immobilized, that doesn't have any effect on the passengers. If the vehicle is wrecked or if it's exploded, then they will have to perform an emergency disembarkation in the usual manner. Like if it's wrecked, they can just do a regular disembark, but they only get to move 3 inches rather than 6 inches. So let's say these guys came in and somehow managed to destroy this Rhino. And let's say they wrecked it. So they didn't explode it, they only wrecked it, which means that it remains there on the table and counts as difficult and dangerous terrain. Well, then these guys can basically disembark from the access point, but instead of moving 6 inches, they only get to move 3 inches. If for any reason some of the models can't disembark because there's no room for them, they're just automatically removed from play. Basically, they're a casualty of the vehicle collapsing in on them, or something like that. After the passengers disembark, they have to take what's called a pinning test, and this is a morale check. So if you're fearless, you don't have to take this. And if they fail that, then they are pinned next turn, which is almost like falling back, except you don't move. It just means that you have to make snapshots. But if you want full details on the pinning rules, go ahead and look in the Warhammer 40k rulebook for that. If the transport explodes, then not only is it removed from play, but the unit inside suffers strength 4 hits. Basically, for every model that there is, they suffer a strength 4 hit. It's not on the model itself. Like if there's 10 guys here, they take 10 strength 4 hits. It's not that you roll for each individual model. You still roll for all of them. They get their full armor saves against this one. Once the vehicle has been removed, then the surviving passengers are placed where the vehicle used to be. And if you can't place the models, once again, they are removed. Sometimes this will happen because some vehicles can hold a large number of guys, and even though the vehicle itself isn't really big enough to do that on the board, and so if it was surrounded when it was destroyed and it exploded, then any guys you couldn't place are just removed. And remember, you have to stay at least 1 inch away from the enemy, so that could also affect it. And that's really all there is to transports. There are special rules, for example, a flyer that is a transport, and we didn't really cover all the open top special rules either, but you can find those more in the rulebook and in other videos in this How to Play Warhammer 40k series. So go ahead and leave your comments and questions below. If you have a question about transports or about anything 40k in general, you can post them below and I'll do my best to make a video to answer that question. Otherwise, happy wargaming. Well, and happy wargaming if you leave a question too.